Strength. Poul and Mildred Downey Broxson. Night still held the western horizon when Shalindra found the Dead Sea unicorn. It stretched sleek amid kelp, timbers, and storm-drowned birds. The sorceress knelt in the wet sand. Zaerui had mentioned that once, in his travels 100 years ago, he had seen a cup carved from such a horn. A king drank from it to ward off poison. One of the beast's great brown eyes stared skyward at the wheeling gulls. Soon they would land and feast. Shalindra stroked the flank, cold in death, but not fish-slimy. What must it be like when alive? Behind the ragged peaks of the Hiwerlas, the sky glowed pale. This early, Shalindra walked the beach alone, but soon the townspeople too would be out searching for gale-brought treasure. Doubtless any of them would offer her the horn, but doubtless also he would exact a price, most likely a healing spell. Those were failing everywhere. She must hoard her magic, in hope of making her son, Langru, strong, or at least controlling the tremor in his hands so he could learn to write. She sighed and looked down at the huge dead beast. The spiral horn measured a good cubit longer than Shalindra stood tall. She pulled. It held fast. She needed a saw sharp enough to cut bone. There was probably one back at the library, but to find it would take time. Meanwhile, someone else might claim her prize. Best not to squander power on a warding spell. Best instead to hurry. In her haste, stumbling over the littered beach, she almost fell across the man. He lay tangled amid seaweed, his hair sand-grimed, his clothing drenched. For a moment she thought him drowned. Then his chest moved. Shalindra stepped back a pace. Whence could he have come if not from the sea? The fingers that dug into the wet sand were unwebbed, and the last merfolk had vanished years ago. No visitors came to Tyrene since the glacier had sealed Icehold Pass. This was no merman, but neither was he of her country. His rough dun tunic was a foreign cut, and he was stockier than folk from hereabouts. He took another shallow breath. Too slow. Shalindra nerved herself to touch his hand. Icy. And his lips were blue. She shook his shoulder. His head lolled. After an eternity, he breathed again. She could see no hurt, yet he would not wake. In winter-time, she'd seen folks stumbling with cold, wits slowed enough that they eventually lay down to sleep forever. She shook him again. No response. Panicked, she looked about. This was taking valuable time. In earlier days she could have warmed him with spells, wakened him, set his blood moving. But she no longer carried charms now that magic was fading. She could abandon him. No. Evil would spring from such a deed. She sighed. She needed strong muscles. Not far off was Gilm's cottage. The carpenter and his grown son could help carry the stranger home. She ran and beat on the door. Gilm swung it open. He grumbled about the stiffness in his back and hands, but he and his son came. They lifted the man as if he were a kitten. Shalindra went ahead to make things ready. She must light a fire, gather blankets, brew tea, anything to restore warmth. Up the ramp to the college, where merfolk formerly squelched from the water, bearing fish and sunken treasures. She spared scarcely a glance for the dragons that flanked the gate. Once they had gleamed with iridescent scales. Now legs, tail, and trunk were dull gray. They had almost turned to stone. One bent its head as she passed. The library was the only building that had not slumped to rubble. Here Shalindra and Langru made their home, amid moldering books no one else could read. She pushed open the door. Its rusting hinges creaked. and stopped, surprised. Already fire blazed, a kettle steamed, and the long copper tub gleamed on the hearth. Olangru was holding blankets near the heat. He looked up when he saw her. His hands twitched, and the blankets tumbled. His eyes sought the outlander. Strange eyes they were, gray-blue bordered with paleness. They were often dreamy, but at this moment seemed intent. "I watched you find him, Mother," the boy said. "I knew you'd want warmth. Is he badly hurt?" Shalindra frowned, puzzled, but voiced no question as Gilm and his son shuffled through the door. "Where you want him, lady?" Gilm growled. "Over there, near the fire." They set the man down and backed away, casting fearful glances at the shadows. "It's a cruel, cold day for my hands," Gilm hinted. "Thank you for your help," said Shalindra. The two left as quickly as they could. She bent over the victim. He still breathed shallowly. "Help me strip him," she ordered Olangru, then bit her lip as the boy fumbled at fastenings. "Keep silence. It's not his fault he was born that way." "Better yet, fetch more blankets." It was difficult for a frail woman to remove his clothing. He lay a dead weight, but at last she heaped the sodden garments on the floor. Where sun had not seared him, his skin gleamed white. She had not seen an unclad man since Zaerowi died, and that was 10 years gone, while she was pregnant with Olangru. This man was of ordinary height, shorter by far than Zaerowi, but he would weigh as much or more. Powerful muscles bulged arms, shoulders, and thighs. His chest was broad. He must be used to heavy work. Square-jawed and blunt-nosed, his features were somewhat rugged. In the manner of the Southerners, he wore his brown hair short, and was accustomed to shave his beard, though several days' worth of stubble showed. "Help me lift him," Shalindra told Olangru. Mother and son strained, and finally eased the stranger into the steaming tub. "More hot water." First came shivering. Then awareness returned. The man opened gray eyes. She answered his unspoken question. "You are in the town of Tyrene, in the old college library where I make my home. I found you on the beach, half dead. Who are you, and whence from?" The cracked lips parted. She leaned forward to catch the words. "I am Brandick. I was on a ship trying to teach men." He swallowed. Yes, his accent was southern. In the years before the pass closed, folk from Aeth had often visited the college to confer with the Zaerowi. "Never mind talking," Shalindra said. She helped him from the tub, wrapped him in warm blankets, and fed him hot tea. "You can tell us all about it later." He slipped into slumber. Shalindra thought she might leave Olangru on watch and go back to the beach, but suddenly Gilm knocked on the door. The old carpenter grinned, held out the sea unicorn horn, and said, "See what I found on the strand, lady? It's yours in trade for a bit of magic." "Thank you," Shalindra said. "What do you wish?" He spread knotted fingers. "It's my hands and back. They pain me sore. Make the hurt go away, and I'll give you this pretty thing." Shalindra held the horn, white, slender, spiral. It was heavy with mana. Any fool could see that. "Very well," she said. "Sit down." The healing spell would not last, and Gilm would complain he had been cheated if she did not add something special. For a few moments she admired the flawless beauty of the horn, before picking up a rasp. She felt almost physical anguish as she scraped. There, that much should suffice. She measured out the usual herbs and powdered pearl and mixed the medicine with wine. Zairowe's wine. She whispered the activating spell and handed Gilm the goblet. "Here, drink. This will help for a time." She watched him gulp. She'd brewed it bitter. After the carpenter left, she picked up what remained of the horn, a great length, but flawed now. She set it in the corner against a stack of musty books. It no longer held power to help a Longru. Perhaps nothing did. She looked down at Brandick. "The fault, stranger, is yours. There you lie. Were you worth it?" The moon had swung through 2 full cycles when Brandick returned to Shalindra's home. First, as propriety required, he had moved elsewhere after he could walk again. The household of Kiernan the blacksmith had been glad to take him in for the sake of hearing about the world beyond Tyreen and its hinterland. No outlander had crossed these ever-narrowing horizons for years. The place was soon beswarmed by people just as eager for news. His vigor regained, Brandick set about earning his keep. When he learned how lacking in huntsman's skills they were hereabouts, though big game was frequently seen, he offered to lead forth a party of young men and teach them something. First, he discovered, it was necessary to prepare weapons for the chase, mainly spears, knives, and slings. With metal become scarce and precious, he chipped stone into points and edges, an art he had seen practiced in wild parts of the south but must largely reinvent himself. Thereafter, he must drill his would-be followers in the use of these things. At last they were ready. Their band was gone so long that kinfolk worried, for it made countless mistakes, but it learned from them, and came home triumphant. Next day Brandick laid across his shoulder a haunch of venison that he had smoked in the field. Stepping out of Kiernan's door, he turned toward the abandoned College of Wizards, where Shalindra dwelt alone with her son. It was a bleakly bright summer morning. Wind harried white clouds through the sky so that their shadows and its whistling swept through grass-grown, ruin-lined streets. Gray-green with glacial flower, the Mad Woman River poured noisily into a bay where whitecaps danced on water the hue of steel. On the southern bank, rubble heaps and snags of towers marked the totally abandoned half of Tyreen. There had been no sense in anyone living across the stream after the bridge collapsed, and only rafts were available. Beyond lay the country where Brandick had been hunting. Often he had spied fallen buildings in those reaches, for that had once been a land of great plantations. Now it was tundra and taiga, bearing naught but grass, moss, dwarf birch and willow, gnarled shrubs. They called it the Barren in Tyreen, and no one in living memory had gone far into it, for what could a man find there to keep himself alive? Brandick struck out northerly through the town, the village, rather, he thought. Just a few hundred souls remained. After weather spells failed and the glaciers marched south, while pests and murrains that were no longer checked by magic ravaged the farms, famine had taken off most of the population. Disease, cold, storm, fighting for scraps accounted for others. Eventually a certain balance had been struck, but everyone who could think knew how precarious it was. Kiernan's house was better than most. Being clever with his hands, the smith had shored up a crumbling structure, even made an addition of timbers salvaged from tenantless places, roughly dovetailed together and chinked with mud. He had ample time for that, since no new iron ever came in and implements were wearing out, rusting away, or getting lost. Still, the demand for repairs, paid for in kind, was sufficient to keep his family reasonably well off. Striding along, Brandick passed dwellings that were little more than caves grubbed out of wreckage, or lean-tos against remnant walls. The bright colors of bricks, the occasional grace of a colonnade, the vividness of a phoenix in a mosaic of which half was gone, somehow made the scene doubly forlorn. What people he met were less miserable than their surroundings, thus far. They were of his own race, though usually lighter complexioned, sometimes blond, and might have been taller than him had not undernourishment stunted growth. However, they were wiry, and his young hunters had not lacked endurance. Their clothes, such as he necessarily wore, would have seemed archaic in Ath. Tunic and trousers for men, long gowns for women, hooded cloaks for both sexes, but were, after all, generally old, when wool and linen were in short supply. If dyes had faded, the patching and darning were carefully done. Brandick did not encounter many persons. Most were out tending their meager fields and sparse flocks, gathering firewood, fishing along the river and bay shores. Those who stayed behind were children, housewives, the aged, the sick, the rare artisan like Kiernan. They hailed him in friendly wise. The meat he had gotten made him a hero. "Hoy! My son told me how you tied a rack of antlers off a reindeer's skull to your head and threw a skin over your back and went on all fours to within spear cast of the herd," said Hente, the weaver. "And that hooked stick of yours for throwing the spear. He claims it doubles the range and force. Won't you show the rest of us?" "Of course," Brandick replied, a bit curtly. He was impatient to be on his way. "You've a whale of a lot to learn here." "A what? A whale of a lot? He! That's a clever un. A southern turn of speech, eh?" Henty cocked his head and regarded the burly man closely. "You're settling down for good, then, are you?" Brandick shrugged. "I've no choice. Therefore I'd better do what I can to make this place fit to live in." "Hoy! You're a gruffin, aren't you?" Hastily, Henty smiled. You'll be wanting a wife, and my daughter Isaiah, well, I think you might like meeting her." "No doubt. Later." Brandick nodded and went on. Henty stared at him. The weaver had little else to do these days, and hunger was often a guest at his board. Crossing Sea Road, Brandick reached the college. Well nigh all its proud buildings had fallen. He could look across weedy grounds and the ruins and hovels beyond, to city walls in nearly as bad repair. He cursed under his breath, not for the first time. Like any prosperous, populous community, Tyreen had made lavish use of magic. Indeed, because of this institution in its midst, it had been still more prodigal of mana than most were. When enchantments began to fail, so did the delicate fantastic works, or the massive ones which they had upheld against gravity and weather. Knowledge was lacking of how to rebuild in mundane fashion. The rot had gnawed less far inward in his homeland, but he had seen it there too, yes, in Aeth itself, which had been the capital of an empire that reckoned Tyreen a rich provincial town. One hall of the college survived in part. Ivy, crawled over amber-hued masonry, would pry it asunder in due course. Meanwhile hid friezes and inscriptions. Windows gaped glassless or were crudely boarded up. A fountain before the entrance held rainwater in its basin, but did not spring any more, and its statue of a dancing maiden was lichenous and blurred. Nevertheless, here was shelter of a sort for many books, and for Shalindra and her boy. Longru sat on the stairs, rocking to and fro. His gaze was vacant, and he did not seem to notice the newcomer. He was tow-headed, handsome of face, but small and thin for his 9 or 10 years of age, unkempt despite everything his mother could do. Brandick found her in the library, reading. A sunbeam, like a flickery sword-blade, came in an ogive window and fell on time-brown pages. In that light, those shadows, the volumes shelved behind seemed to stir, and the sound of the wind was as if they sighed. Wrapped in a cloak against the chill, her slight form was hidden from him. He saw only a finely shaped face, large brown eyes, waist-length cataract of russet hair. "Oh," She peered nearsightedly before recognition came. Well, he thought, she'd scarcely seen him since he left her. "Brandick of Arth, what do you wish?"
"To give you this," he said.
The nearby table being piled high with tomes, he laid the meat down on the carpetless, stone-flagged floor.
"I reckoned you could use it."
"Why?" She rose, stooped over and handled it, straightened and looked at him in wonder. "I know not how to thank you."
"No thanks needed, lady," he growled. "You saved my life, didn't you?"
He paused, forcing himself before he could add,
"I hope I gave no offense. If I did, well, I was newly hauled from the sea and half out of my head from grief at loss of shipmates and everything."
"Oh, no, you never did," she murmured.
"Then why? I mean, everybody else wanted to hear what I could tell of the South. You never came to listen. Why not?"
She winced. Her gaze dropped. "I don't like crowds." He could barely hear her. "Longru would have wanted to come along, and too many of them have been cruel to him, because he is different. I kept hoping you would visit us."
"I should have, but it seemed I was always busy finding my way around, getting things set up for that hunt and then off on it. Shalindra, I came as soon as I could, honestly."
Brandick smote fist into palm. The noise cracked loud through the dusty stillness.
"But they're so ignorant. They don't see what's under their noses, and chaos take it, this is a survival matter. I'll have to live here too, you know, and I admit I'm not a very patient man."
She smiled and touched his arm. "Well, you came. Now I can hear your story at leisure, as I'd wanted to. Sit down." She pointed to an elaborately carved chair opposite hers. "I'll brew us a pot of tea." "No." She laughed, and the clarity of that sound challenged the gloom around them. "I've some wine left that my husband made. Noble stuff. I swear that whatever magic he used has not gone out of it. A guest from Imperial Arth, who's brought such a magnificent gift. Yes, surely this is worth a small bottle." In addition, she fetched bread and cheese, not much, for she had little, and she and Brandick settled down to a lively conversation. They had heard something about each other from third parties, but this was their first chance to become really acquainted. Brandick was shorter spoken.
"I was a younger son of a baron at home. It's barons and petty kings there. The empire is just a memory. The climate is milder than here, but not notably, and worse every year. I saw things falling apart, the same as they've already done for you, and wondered what to do about it. Hunting. Hunting was always a pleasure of mine, and I learned a lot from the wild tribes that have drifted into the Humtulips forest these past 100 years. But I also thought we might try reviving coastwise shipping, get in contact with lost provinces, start trade again, and, well, I had a ship built and headed north, exploring. Without magic, she proved unseaworthy, for the rites had small skill. She foundered in the storm outside Tyrene Bay. I clung to a plank, and that's all I remember till I woke up in your care. Everybody else must have drowned."
He grimaced.
"No way for me to return, hey? North and east the mountain passes are choked by the glaciers. South, the barren is too wide. It's rich in wildlife close by, but I found that farther on it's still almost empty, and a man would starve before he got across. So, here I am."
Shalindra told her story at greater length, though there was actually less of it. Her husband, Zaerawi, had been the dean of the college, a wizard as learned and accomplished as the dwindling of mana in the world allowed. She was his 10th wife, for he was centuries old and had never been able, in this gaunt age, to cast a longevity spell on anyone else. Yet he and Shalindra were happy, and she was carrying their firstborn when suddenly the enchantment that kept him young guttered out, and she did not care to talk about that. Since she had lived by the scant magic, ever less, that she commanded, and by trading off possessions for food, and by what work she could get as a scribe or clerk or the like. She was nearly the last literate person in Tyrene. Mostly, talking with Brandeck, she sounded him out about the South, as her fellow townsfolk had done. Did she press him too closely, or did he simply feel too deep a wound? He could not say. He only knew that at last he exclaimed,
"The demons take that. Cities, books, riches, peace, leisure, yes, farms, metals. They're done. They're going the way the magic has gone, and you'll go too if you don't learn how to live in the world we've got."
She stiffened in her chair. "What do you mean?"
"You people, fumbling around on your niggard acres with your starveling livestock when more and more big game is moving south ahead of the glaciers. Elk, reindeer, boar, horse, aurochs, wisent, mammoth. You're trying to patch up junk heaps like this building, when you could find out how to make shelters that are warm and weather-tight."
His fist struck his knee.
"I tried to give the old world new life by my ship. The sea taught me better. Now I've got to teach all of you."
Shocked, she whispered, "Do you mean we should give up our whole civilization, all the old ways, and become savages?"
"No."
Pride straightened her back and squared her shoulders. "Quit if you wish, Brandeck. I had expected more from a man of Aeth, but do as you will. I am a sorceress in my own right, the wife of the dean of the college, yes, still his wife, and mother of his son. No, I'll not betray that heritage, nor will Elangru after me." They glared at each other before changing the subject. He left as soon as decently possible, and their parting was cool. Autumn was drawing to a close, and Shalindra dreaded the coming season. Rain-raw wind whined through the windows, and the college fountain brimmed with sodden leaves. Snowdrifts soon would smother Tyrene. Each year the frost fell earlier. As always, when cold crept down the stone walls, Elangru sickened. Formerly, Shalindra's medicines could soothe the rattle in his chest and cool his fever, but of late they availed little. Each winter's illness left him more weakened. Even in summer he coughed. If only, Shalindra thought, they could stay warm and dry. Today he lay flushed, eyes bright, staring at something his mother could not see. He held out his arms, spread his fingers, and chanted, "Soaring over glittery waves, fish like silver needles, winds cradle me, Tyrene lies tiny far down. The boys romp in the street, I could stoop on them, but why bother? It's cool and blue here, the sun warms my wings, the fish below me dance for joy." Shalindra sponged his forehead. He often babbled thus, claiming to be a hawk, a fox, once a great shambling bear, Elangru, who had never walked the barren or the forest. He had merely seen wild animals in books. Elangru spent his life cowering in the library, hidden from the jeers and taunts of normal children. The townsfolk knew him to be sincere in his claims, so they thought him mad. Had Zairui lived, could he have helped his son? The boy needed fruit, fresh vegetables, milk. For perhaps the 20th time that day, Shalindra opened her larder. The shelves gleamed bare. One hook, amid an empty dozen, held a shoulder of smoked elk, a gift from Brandeck. Its gamey taste was strange to one used to fat beef cattle. Yet it was the sole meat Shalindra had, and she was grateful for whatever Brandeck did to preserve it. Long ago, spoilage was no problem. A simple spell kept meat and produce fresh. But over time, magic had faded. She remembered going to her larder one morning to fix Zairui a festive breakfast. She had opened the door and gagged at corruption. Now her problem was finding anything to eat. Brandeck brought food, sometimes a silent leaving on the doorstep, but charity made a bitter meal. Tyreen ate better, though. Brandeck was teaching his hunting band new ways. Kiernan's son, Destug, for instance, scorned to work in metal. He'd fashioned a spear and hunted for a living. The spear point was flint, Brandeck's work likewise. Knives made by Destug's father lay broken and rusted. Again Shalindra examined the shelves. She might have overlooked something. The smoked meat, part of a cheese, a crust of bread. That was all. Most of her possessions she had bartered away. Last to go were the carved chair, her ivory boxes, the circlet that once bound her hair. Naught remained but the books. She would not part with those. Had she wished to, they were valueless. Tyreen no longer wanted even a writing of births, deaths, and marriages. Shalindra raised her hands to her face. Her last gold bracelet slid down a thin arm. "No, I'll not trade that. Not Zaerowi's wedding gift. It would buy food for a short time, but soon that too would be eaten. So what's to do? I'm scarcely a sorceress any longer." Old Abba, for instance, was among her failures. Shalindra had helped her for years, until abruptly the potions no longer worked. The laundress had sickened and died in weeks. Her family thought Shalindra had willfully held back magic. But there is no magic left. At least, not in me. An idea struck her. She laughed, a choking sound, quickly stifled. She did not wish to rouse Alangru. Since Abba's death, Tyreen lacked a laundress. Well, Shalindra did know how to make soap, and washing was an honorable task, not like being someone's kept woman, or worse. The townsfolk might not need a scribe, but they did need clean clothes. She dragged out the big coppered tub and inspected it. Dents and spots worn thin were plentiful, but it should hold together for a while. She checked on Alangru a final time, and set forth, seeking work. Shalindra knelt by the tub, scrubbing. Alangru, a book propped on his lap, read aloud. On demand he could fetch more hot water, but he was too clumsy for any real labor. The shirt she washed was patched. How long since anyone had had strong new linen, cotton, wool? Hente the weaver sat idle. His sons had joined Brandeck's band and fed their parents. Alangru read on. To ensure fair weather for a festival, take clippings from the mane of a white unicorn, the oily tears of a mer-child, and, in an amethyst flask, gather dragon's breath. On the night of the dark moon, mix these together. Shalindra lifted the shirt. How long since unicorns pranced or merfolk swam? How long since the college's guardian dragons had last moved? Gently she wrung out soapy water. The shirt came apart in her hands. Rough hands, work-reddened. No longer the fingers Zaeroi had kissed. Cloth garments were vanishing. Brandeck and his hunters wore animal hides, harsh on the skin and clumsily sewn. She looked at the blue fabric of her gown. It hung soft against her body, draped in pleasing folds. But the hem was threadbare, and the sleeves were patched. She wiped a soapy arm across her eyes, lest Alangru see her tears. Day at midwinter was brief and pale in this land, when clouds did not make twilight of it, or snowstorms strike men with white blindness. Brandek could seldom go to sleep at nightfall or sit quietly in the house he had occupied. It was too cold and dark. He had been using odd moments to carve fat-burning lamps out of soapstone, but as yet he had only 3. Hence he became a frequenter of the last tavern in Tyrene. The magical light globes there were extinct too, but you needed no more than hearth glow to drink by. Besides, he usually enjoyed the company, and if nothing else, it was well to be friendly, for some people resented his rapid rise to dominance. One night was frozenly clear. A full moon cast long shadows from the east and made the snow sheen and glisten. Beneath it, he saw the peaks of the He-Wurlas thrust whiter still above the horizon. Elsewhere, stars thronged heaven, and the silver torrent cataracted in the same silence that made the scrunch of his boots on the snow seem loud. His breath went ghostly before him. The cold slid fingers past his garments. Fur and leather were better than cloth, but none of the men who tried had yet perfected the art of preparing these materials, nor had any woman, in this case Hente's daughter Rasiah, anxious to impress the great hunter, grown skillful at making clothes from them. Well, that would come with experience, Brandek knew. He hefted the flint-headed spear he carried, and his free hand dropped to the obsidian knife at his hip. Several men, himself included, were already good at shaping stone. So much to learn, discover, master. A sigh sent Brandek's breath flying. He often thought that the existence of mana had finally proven more a curse than a blessing. When it was exhausted through use, mankind knew very little else. Without it, the race would have developed techniques which depended only on the enduring aspects of the world. For instance, there must be a better way to light a dwelling than by a wick afloat in a bowl of grease. But no one was likely to hit upon any when countless different inventions were more urgently needed. He saw the green merman ahead and lengthened his stride. The tavern was formerly the house of someone who could not pay magicians to help in the construction. Hence it abided, though much decayed in the timbers, amidst hillocks which had been more pretentious neighbors. Light seeped dim around the edges of warped door and shutters. Smoke billowed from a hole in the roof where tiles had been removed when spells no longer kept weather balmy. Wolves began to howl. They sounded like a large pack and right outside the north gate. Belike they were in quest of livestock. It was becoming impossible to keep herds or flocks safe from predators. More than once Brandek had raged at the owners that they wasted time trying when the coastal plain and the mountains held abundant wild game. Their sons usually agreed with him, and that had broken several families, and that had earned him added reproaches by Shalindra. Brandek flung the tavern door wide and stamped in. "Red wine! A mug of it!" he roared. The air made his eyes and lungs sting. Just 4 men clustered at the single table amidst unrestful, thick shadows. Money was meaningless, and few could spare goods to swap for the diminishing store of drink. Brandek had ample credit from the pelts he brought out of the wilderness, and endeared himself to chosen fellow patrons by treating them. Tonight they spoke no welcome, but sat tense. Even muffled by walls, it was as if the sudden wolf howls had pierced them. Turbrit, the landlord, must swallow before he could say huskily, "I'm sorry. No more wine." "What?" Brandek was astounded. "I've seen—" "Yes, sir. 2 barrels were left. After that, no more wine, ever. And Jaeth, the chirurgeon, he and a lot of others came to tell me it should be kept for those who are in pain or need his knife. The Lord Mayor's taken charge of it." Brandek uttered an oath, then curbed his temper. For the most part, city government had become a solemn farce. He, the outlander, had already gained more real power, merely by showing people how to survive and browbeating them into doing so. He had still less faith in the chirurgeon. A fate deliver him from ever falling into those untrained hands. However, many did trust Jaeth, and the belief doubtless strengthened them. Therefore, turning the wine over to him was a move toward solidarity in this divided and demoralized community.
"All right," Brandick said. "Beer'll do. It'd better."
Nobody chuckled. He settled down on a bench next to Gilm, the carpenter, who mumbled,
"Soon no more beer either. Drink it while it's there."
He had obviously been setting an example. With abrupt violence he banged his goblet on the table.
"I got credit. Gave Turbot the 2 halves of a saw after it broke today. Next to last saw in my kit. Turbot says he'll have Kiernan turn it into knives. No way to make a new saw, of course. Who needs cabinets or cedar chests any longer anyway? Houses? Why, the wood we can pull out of the ruins is generally rotten, and the northern forests are under the glacier, and no ships bring timber from the south."
He hiccuped.
"My son began in my trade too, you remember. He'll not end in it. No call for carpenters." "What'll he do?"
Brandick clapped the man's shoulder.
"Let him learn hunting, or stone chipping, or any of a host of crafts that really are needed. I'll be glad to teach him what I can. Teach him to be a savage."
The wolf chorus, which had quieted, broke forth again. Wisnar, who farmed, traced a sign across his broad breast. His beard fell that far down, not many razors remained. Brandick had acquired one and used it regularly as a way of maintaining he was no enemy of civilization. "What's that you do?" asked Larry, who had been a merchant and now lived by trading away what remained in his warehouses. Fear shrilled through his voice.
"I make the mark of my family," Wisnar told them, "hoping my forebears will guard me against yonder demons, for the gods died long ago."
The landlord stiffened where he stood, tapping the beer.
"Hold on," he exclaimed. "I'll not have another Alskin in this house."
Wisnar bridled, dread half lost in indignation.
"I'm no such thing. You ought to know me better than that, all of you."
"An Alskin?" asked Brandick. "What do you mean?"
Anxious to smooth matters over, Turbot said fast,
"Alskin was a man of his town, a few years ago, who claimed he had found a stone so full of mana that he was now as mighty as a sorcerer as Zararui was of old. Many believed him, and in their need showered him with gifts and did his every bidding. But then it was found he had nothing more, really, than sleight of hand and other such tricks. A mob tore him apart, and the building he was in as well. I'm sorry, Wisnar, I spoke too fast. You're no charlatan like that, I'm sure. I was only anxious lest the green merman suffer."
The farmer shook his head.
"No, I'm no fraud. I make no claims for myself. I told you what I did. Beseech, just beseech my forefathers to help me. It may well be that their bones in their graves as dead as magic itself, but—"
He grimaced as if in pain.
"But what harm in calling on them when we who live are helpless against those demons out there?"
"Those?"
Brandick protested. "They're only wolves."
"Only?" Wisnar yelled. "If you knew their cunning, if you knew the harm they've wrought me, if they aren't demons themselves, then they're possessed. And what shall stand between us and them?"
"But I'd not call on ghosts for help," Larry quavered. "Who knows what ghosts might want?" A shudder ran around the table. Turbot's hand slopped the beer he set down before Brandick. The wolves howled louder. From afar, A mammoth trumpeted. A groan arose, and 2 men covered their eyes. Aged Firlai alone sat as still as the southerner. Once he had been the town's interpreter for the last of the merfolk who came trading. He had been accustomed to the unhuman, yet it could be seen that he thrust his quietness upon himself, and what he said was,
"The magic is gone. But muster your courage, lads, the courage to hope that our Father of the Tusks will be merciful to us."
"Would he take an offering, do you think?" Larry asked. Brandik's fist crashed on the board. "Let him offer to us," he answered deep in his throat. "A walking horde of meat, bone, hide, ivory. You dread him simply because his kind has very lately come down from the north. What other cause is there? Stop quaking at every change that happens along and use your common sense." He made a spitting noise. "If you have any."
"Too much has changed too soon," Turbot said, and slumped down onto the bench. "Aye," Firlai murmured. "Everything now is unknown. We're like sailors on a rudderless boat, adrift in a fog. Nothing has left us but courage, and it must stand naked."
"Then don't weaken it by whimpering," Brandik snapped at them all. His words did not lash them into a healthy anger as he wished. They sat huddled in their terror. Wisner did retort with dull resentment.
"You're no help yourself, fellow. You throw your weight around like a legate of the Empire, but the Empire's dust on the wind, and what you really do is turn our children against us."
"I try to show them how Tyreen can best survive," Brandik said in a milder tone. He would not openly admit what he realized, that he was often too overbearing. Such was his nature, and the terrible plight of these people did not make him patient with fecklessness.
"Yes, like that boy in your hunting party who met his death last month," Wisner answered.
"He saw something strange at the riverside where we were," Brandik explained for the 10th time. "He panicked, bolted off, went through thin ice, and drowned before we could reach him. The strange thing turned out to be no more than another beast new to these parts. A rhinoceros, we'd call it in Aeth, though this was woolly. A calf, at that, surely strayed from its mother." He did not remind them that a third of his band had refused to help kill the animal, and later nobody at home would touch the valuable carcass. They supposed a nameless evil force must be in it, and knew not how to cope. He had requested aid of Shalindra. She could pretend to cast a spell and annul the curse. Appalled, she refused to debase the art which had been her husband's and her own. Let it lie honorably in its grave. Besides, who could tell what misfortune might indeed come of a thing which had already claimed one life? He had snarled and stamped off. Inwardly, almost reluctantly, he mourned that this had further widened the rift between them. Firlai nodded his white head.
"Aye, Brandik, you mean well, and you do well," he said. "You show us ways of coping with the material world, ways we'd never have thought of by ourselves. However, you are no visionary. You spoke of common sense. How can that exist when nothing makes sense any more?"
The question pierced. The old man had wisdom of a sort. If the heart went altogether out of them, whatever skills they gained, the folk of Tyreen would not have long to live. Brandik's hand closed on his crude wooden goblet, as though to splinter it. The wolves and the mammoth chanted through the night around him. A warm spring breeze scurried into the courtyard, bearing a whiff of Brandek's latest project. He had discovered some new way to cure hides. In Shalindra's opinion, the stench was even more offensive than in the old method of scraping and drying. Hente, the weaver, grieved at the advent of leather garments, but since weather spells had failed, the flax crops were blighted. Wolves, driven south before the ice, harried the sheep and made wool unobtainable. Folk simply had no way to produce cloth. Hente's youngest son tanned skins for a living. Shalindra poured hot water into the fountain and started a wash. Little enough work was left for her. Each week more clothes fell to tatters. The pleasant morning had tempted Alangru out of the compound. She let him go. She could not shelter him forever. Already he stood nearly as tall as his mother. In a few years he would shoot up into manhood. What life will there be for him then? Her son lacked the brute strength to face this world. Soft-shod feet shuffled across cobbles. She turned and gasped. Alangru's face was a sheet of gore. His tunic flapped over skinned knees, and his knuckles were raw. Tears had traced dirty paths down his cheeks. Behind him loomed Brandek, dressed for the hunt. Shalindra sprang forward. "What have you done to him?" she shrilled. Though she knew the question was stupid, Brandek did not harm children.
"It's only a bloody nose," the Southerner said. "They always look dramatic. It's mostly stopped running. Wash your face, young man. You've scared your mother."
Alangru nodded gravely and stepped over to the fountain. It was full of laundry, so he cupped water in his palms. Last winter, Shalindra's copper tub had holed through. No one knew how to patch it. The fountain, which was granite, endured. The dancing maiden's outstretched hand held a bowl of fat ash soap. Shalindra watched the worst of the blood rinse away. Brandek was right. The injuries were minor. She was ashamed of her outburst. "Come inside," she said, "and you both can tell me what happened." Brandek sat on the floor, his back against a pile of books. Most of Shalindra's furniture was gone, broken, or traded. He gulped herb tea from a fragile ceramic cup. Around its rim writhed red and golden dragons. Alangru and Shalindra drank from wooden mugs.
"I was walking out Sea Road by the market when I heard shouting. There was Alangru and a knot of older boys, 6 of them, but he was putting up a good fight. I think Mintu led them as usual. He's the one with the loud mouth. I should take that bully out hunting aurochs, if he brings a good supply of dry breeks."
Alangru, who sat between his mother and Brandek, nodded. "It was Mintu. He didn't like what I said." "I've told you not to get into arguments with those boys," Shalindra began, but Alangru cut her off. "Mintu was telling lies. He said he'd gone hunting alone and killed an elk. It was too big to drag home, and a pack of wolves ate it. He killed most of them, too. He said he was every bit as good a hunter as Brandek and knew how to chip sharper spear points. I couldn't let him go on bragging like that, so I told them I'd seen what really happened." Shalindra frowned. Her son often had wild fancies. He continued, "Mintu never killed any elk. He's scared to be out alone, and he made so much noise in the woods that even the weasels were laughing. He found an elk that had been dead since last fall. They don't even have antlers in the spring." He looked up at Brandek. "You know that. You told me." The man nodded. "It was by the river upstream, mostly just bones. He'd borrowed his father's saw. He finally cut one antler loose, but he was too lazy to take the other, so he left it and came back with a made-up story. I saw it all." "Alangru," Shalindra said. "How far upstream was this, did you say?" "Most of a morning's walk for Mintu. I flew." You flew. Shalindra's tone was flat. Of course. I was an eagle. I like that. You can see everything and swoop down on rabbits, but I feel sorry for them, they squeal so. You can soar with the sun warm on your wings and the world tiny down below. The roof of the library is gray-green and tiles are missing on the west wing where the ceiling leaks. You can hardly see the dragon statues. His eyes were brilliant. Shalindra slapped him. Ulangru's head rocked back. His nose dripped fresh crimson. Aghast, Shalindra looked at her blood-smeared palm. I shouldn't have struck you, dear, she stammered. But you shouldn't tell stories. That's what Mintu said before they beat me. Ulangru set down his mug and shuffled from the room. Silence settled, broken only by fire hiss and the boom of a wind turning raw. Brandick frowned, but held his peace, while Shalindra stared into the depths of her mug. The wood was warped and cracking. He had told her hot liquids caused that, and added with a laugh that the tavern had no such problem. Well, he swilled enough of its beer. Finally Brandick spoke. The business was more serious than Ulangru told you. Those boys were afraid. They were ready to tear him apart for being different. If I hadn't come along, they might have killed him. I don't know what I think of his story, but they half believed it. Mintu most of all. Ulangru has always been a strange one, Shalindra admitted. If she gazed straight ahead, into the fire, she could almost imagine that Zaerawi sat in his accustomed chair. But if she looked, he would not be. And the chair was gone too, traded off last autumn. She gulped. Maybe it's my fault. Ulangru's father died before he was born. She bit her lip. Tell me, Brandick urged. Shalindra was about to refuse, but words spilled forth. It was a fine fall day 11 years ago. We were expecting a guest from Olana beyond the mountains. Zaerawi and the scholar wished to confer on why magic was fading and whether anything might bring it back. We flew to meet the party at Icehold Pass. It was an easy journey, Zaerawi on his great black griffin, I on my winged unicorn. The air was crisp as apples. We raced and arrived before our guests. As we landed, we could see them far off down the road. The scholar did not care to fly, so his group moved more slowly. While we waited, I told Zaerawi what I'd learned by divination that morning. I was carrying his son. He whooped for joy. We'll name him Ulangru. He spun me a veil of sunbeams and wove a crown of golden leaves. A simple magic, that, only a small, simple magic. She swallowed. She dared not weep. Then it happened. Zaerawi clutched his chest. His hair bleached white, and his face wrinkled. He gasped one word. Run. I did not want to leave him. He hurled a lightning bolt, and my mount screamed and took flight. His own griffin stood like black stone. I looked back once to see the mountains slump, and the glacier grind green ice across the pass. Then my unicorn fluttered earthward like an autumn leaf, and died. When I reached Tyrene, my feet were bleeding, and I was half-starved. The town had fallen to rubble. Folk crouched amid wreckage. Snow howled early that year. When spring came, the pass did not open. I took shelter in the college library, and here I bore Ulangru, Zaerawi's last son. Silence again. A gust through an empty window flooded some sheets of paper that lay on the table, weighted down by a useless scrying stone. Shalindra had been practicing calligraphy lest her work stiffen her fingers till she almost lost that equally useless art.
"And was Alangru always the way he is?"
Brandick's question was soft. "Yes," she said. "He talked at the normal age. Nothing wrong with his mind. But he had trouble learning to feed himself and walk. I don't know the reason or what went awry. It may be that the magic that wards babes has faded too."
"All magic is going, Shalindra. You know that. There was just so much in the world, and men used it up. We can only keep on, and in different ways. It won't be easy."
Brandick leaned forward, almost touching her.
"I have an idea I want to try this summer. Boats."
"You nearly died when your ship sank," the woman said, a trifle shocked. "Haven't you seen enough of the sea?"
"I dared too much. This time I'm minded to build small craft, not sailed, but paddled, to venture no farther than the mouth of Tyreen Bay. We could do offshore fishing, and gather eggs on Gearfowl Island. Maybe, as our skill grows, we can advance to larger vessels and longer trips.
Begin reopening coastwise trade routes," he went on. Shalindra merely half-listened until he mentioned hides. She remembered the stench.
"I'm finding new ways of treating leather. We can already make it supple for clothing, but now we can make it strong and waterproof as well. I can cover a wooden frame lashed together with skins smeared in grease. Given careful stitching, that should produce a reliable hull."
It was as if Shalindra heard the drip, drip, drip from the west wing in every downpour. "Hides can keep water out?"
"Yes,"
said Brandick.
"If first you cure them in—"
Excitement flared through her. "But that means I can save the books. The damp is killing them. Look at that stack. I've been trying to dry them by the fire. The rain comes in through holes in the roof that nobody can repair. A watertight shelter." Brandick reached back and took a volume. The cover was black with mildew. He opened it. Moisture had freckled the pages.
"Longevity spells,"
he grunted and shook his head.
"Those haven't worked for years, generations, most places. What's the use?"
He set the book on the floor. Shalindra rose. Staggering under the weight, she returned it to the stack. "If you misfile an item in a library this size—" She gestured at shelves stretching endless down the gloom of halls beyond this chamber. "You have lost it."
Brandick shrugged. "And what if you have? I'm educated, like you, and you've taught your boy. But how many others in Tyreen care a belch about writing? You've told me how you couldn't find recent employment as a scribe. People are cold, hungry, and afraid. Better they learn to hunt, make tools, build shelters, not read crumbling books of worthless wizard lore."
"Worthless wizard lore." The words stung Shalindra like a slap. "Barbarian! Would you make all men illiterate? Have them trust naught but half-remembered tales?" Brandick flushed, gnawed his lip, and finally replied,
"Haven't we squabbled about this often enough? Books were good to have once. Today they might serve to start fires."
He shook his head.
"No, I can't spare you any hides for this shelter. We'll need all we can get, and then some to make those coracles."
His curbed anger broke loose, and he almost shouted,
"Or would you rather keep reading until everybody starves to death in this ice trap that's got us?"
"Well, I know," Shalindra said word by word, "that the ice has us trapped. My Zaerowi's bones lie beneath it. Would that they were yours instead." She turned her back. Brandick sprang up. She heard something crunch and turned again. In his haste he had kicked his cup across the floor, and it shattered. The fragile, ancient cup for guests. She saw a dragon's eye gleam gold on one fragment, as if to cast a look of despair upon the world. She held her tone steady. "So you've smashed that, too, as you'd smash everything else that was ours. You'll never rest, will you, till you've ground the last spark of civilization under your heel, and we're all filthy, stinking savages, hunkered in caves with blood on our hands. Tell me, Brandick, shall we still cook our meat then, or do you want us to forget about fire also?"
"You seemed well pleased to eat the meat I left here while you huddled among your precious books," he growled, and snatched a volume from the nearest shelf. "A Dictionary of the Mer-tongue. How fine! What a shame the merfolk are gone!" He chose another at random. "Raising the Dead. Yes, I can see how you'd like that, Shalindra. You're more at home with the dead than the living, no?" He dropped both tomes. The spines broke. Loose pages swirled across the room. "Meanwhile, you take in laundry from the village. That's the best your sorcery can do for you, and you refuse to learn anything new." He drew an uneven breath. "Teeth of doom, woman! It's magic that is dead. Give it a decent burial and come alive again yourself."
Shalindra knelt, gathering scattered paper. Her hands shook. Brandick was right in his way. Her powers were gone. How many more years could she do heavy labor? Tears blurred her vision, and she turned away. There in the corner gleamed something white and slender. She remembered suddenly what it was. She surged to her feet and strode across the room. The sea unicorn's horn was long, heavier than it looked. She laid hold of the spiral-curved lance. "Get out," she said. "Get out. Take this with you. It was the price of your life. I made a poor bargain. This, at least, once held mana." She proffered it point first. "He thinks I'll stab him." She stifled a laugh. His eyes narrowed. He touched the hilt of his knife, then let his hands fall and backed away. He fumbled at the latch. The door creaked open. He gathered his spear, throwing stick, and axe. In his furs, he looked like a savage. He began to say something. Shalindra threw the horn after him. It shattered on the cobbles beyond. "Take it, you barbarian!" she screamed. "And be gone!" The Landru pushed past her. "Brandick, don't leave!" the boy pleaded. Shalindra leaned against the wall, put an arm across her eyes, and wept. She heard Landru stumble after Brandick, calling. The man soon outdistanced him. The Landru called once more, gave up, and started back. Afar, a mammoth trumpeted, harbinger of the oncoming ice. Kren, son of Wisnar, and Destag, son of Kiernan, waited as agreed outside the great gate. It was no longer much more than a hill of tumbled blocks from which a sculptured head, noseless, stared blindly eastward. The youths were about the same age, probably 20 winters. Though Kren was blond and Destag dark, somehow they looked alike as they stood there. Perhaps it was their outfits, garb of fur-trimmed leather, spear in hand, throwing stick and knife tucked into belt, 2 extra spears and a sleeping bag, and packet of dried meat secured by thongs across the back. Or perhaps it was their build. Undernourished in childhood, they shared a leanness which long tours on the hunt after Brandick came were turning rangy. In their eyes, too, was a feral quality Tyreen had never known before. "What kept you, sir?" Kren asked. "A spot of trouble. Never mind about that," Brandick snapped. Inwardly he recognized that it had been well to rescue a Landru, but wrong to dawdle with Shalindra when his followers expected him. Why had he done it? Did some remnant of witchcraft still cling to her? "Let's be off. The morning's already old." "Where are we bound this time?" Destag inquired eagerly. Brandick's plan had been to go after horse. A herd had been spied yesterday north of here. A large party would alarm the beast too early, but a few men, sound of wind and limb, could get sufficiently close that, when the creatures did bolt, they could run one down, driving it between them as wolves do. Lately he had been experimenting with a noose on a long cord to cast around the neck of an animal, but this was a skill which would take a while to develop. Now he looked east, away from the town, across miles whose emptiness was scarcely broken by a few tumble-down abandoned farm buildings, until the snow peaks of the Hiwarlas caught his glance. "Yonder," he said with a gesture. Bear had become plentiful in the uplands. Newly roused from winter sleep, such a brute would be gaunt and savage, but nonetheless a prize. And he needed a fight. The others were astonished. "Spring is a dangerous season in the mountains," Kren blurted. "Avalanches." Brandick fashioned a sneer. "Stay behind if you're afraid." "I'm not." Yet Kren added hesitantly, "It's just that you're always telling us yourself, sir, the chase is risky enough without taking chances we don't have to." "But you mean we've got to discover how to get along in any kind of conditions, don't you, sir?" Destag's earnest question sealed the matter. Brandick felt he could hardly change his mind after it, though beneath the seething, a part of him regretted his impulse. Leading people starved for certitudes, he must always pretend to a kind of mana of his own. He nodded and set forth at a steady lope. His disciples came behind. They could maintain the pace with brief pauses till evening, when it would have brought them well into the chaotic lands below the heights. They could not spare breath for talk, however, and Brandick found himself locked up with his thoughts. All his spears were tied to his shoulders. He gripped the axe he bore until knuckles stood white. It was another experiment of his, a flint blade set through a haft. After numerous failures, he dared hope that the lashings of shrunken rawhide would keep stone wedded to wood, but only heavy use would show if he had really found his way to making a trustworthy tool. Wedded. He might as well go ahead and marry Hente's daughter, Rasaya. She wasn't bad-looking, and she had acquired the necessary new skills faster than most. Of course, Kiernan's youngest had a fullness about her suggesting she'd be a lively bedmate as well as bearing him strong children. They were chaste and monogamous in Tyrene, but he was the most desirable husband material they knew, and he must have offspring, daughters to bind him in family alliances, sons to aid him, and in the end, if he lived to be old, care for him, and his loins often burned. Curse Shalindra anyhow. Too long had he buzzed about that slim body, that deep mind. No, that skinny, near-sighted, daydreaming jackdaw. Most of her childbearing years were behind her, too. She was doubtless good for 3 or 4 yet, but could expect to lose at least 1 in infancy. Why should he care? She and her books and her useless brat. He was being unfair. Alangru couldn't help his own helplessness and bore it with a certain gallantry. But why had she and Brandick gone on month after month when nearly every meeting ended in a fight? Well, whatever he owed her, he had paid back 100-fold, and today she herself had screamed that there never was any debt and had flung the token of it at his feet. Must she take so hard the breaking of a cup? How like her. Oh, yes, Brandick thought. It had been a pretty object, and he was sorry. He even wished he could offer her a replacement, however crude. But his attempts to make vessels of fired clay during the winter had come to naught. That was evidently an art whose development would take more time than anyone could spare these days from creating the means of stark survival. His boot soles whispered on stone. At the great gate, Sea Road became A5 Way and ran across the coastal plain over Icehold Pass to the rich province beyond, formerly. Without magical maintenance, rains washed out the shallow bed, thin paving blocks slid apart and roots of grass cracked them to bits. The thoroughfare was already a mere trace, and in a century or two would be erased. For that matter, the pass had been choked on the day when Shalindra was widowed. Brandick glanced about him. To right and left he glimpsed stumps. Orchards had been cut down for firewood after frost killed them. Everywhere else, the grass of springtime billowed pale green beneath a wind that came sliding chill off the ocean. The air was full of water and earthy odors. Clouds scudded white. Their shadows scythed across the land. Birds clamored aloft in huge flocks. Brandick wondered if he could find a means to cast a dart that high. Ahead, the range shouldered above the horizon, blue-gray where it was not whitened. He made out that tower-like peak men called the Bridegroom. A scowl seized his brow. He turned off the dying road toward a different height, around which ice crystals flurried and glittered, the one they called Rip Snarl. At eventide, the party made camp below that mountain. Although they were well into the chaotic land by then, they heard wolves howl after sunset, and later, a deep-throated roar. Once the He-Whirlers had lifted sheer from the coastal plain, legend said that a god had fashioned them thus to create a dramatic pattern. But gods died and magic faded, and at last no force remained to uphold those forms. When they slumped, great chunks of them came crashing down to make a jumble below the remaining steeps. This wreckage provided some grazing for chamois, and ample dens for bear and cave lion. These sought most of their food in the outer parts, strewn across miles. There boulders the size of houses, or whole walls of them, gave weather shelter to plant life that in turn nourished animals. A night in such a coppice had not calmed Brandick. He had slept ill in his bag, quarreling with Shalindra in his very dreams. At dawn, he was brusque with his companions. "We'll spend the day separately in search of spoor," he told them. "We'll meet here before dark, exchange information, and lay our plans. Don't forget for a moment how easy it is to lose your way hereabouts. Keep taking bearings on peaks and sun, but don't trust them much. Rain or fog or whatever can blot them out of your sight, so memorize landmarks as you go, and make marks where you can. If you do get lost, don't panic. Settle down. Wait till you see the sky again and work your way toward the west. You'll come out in the open eventually and be able to locate this camp." He paused. "If not, we're better off without you." They reddened at his unwanted condescension. Usually he had been genial and sympathetic in his bluff fashion. "Yes, sir," Kren said, while Destug's features showed hurt. The young men took up their loose spears and went in different directions. Brandick lingered for a bit. Oaths muttered from him. Half were aimed at himself. He was being a fool, he knew. What sense in taking out on those lads his fury at Shalindra? And what did it matter in the first place what she said or did? She and her weird boy, yes, that was why the children persecuted Olangru. A strangeness possessed him, and in a world from which the comforting, controlling, explaining Mana had departed, strangeness was a terror, therefore an object of hatred. Those two were ghosts and did not know it. Then let her stop haunting him. He spat and struck off on his own. Scrub birch, nestled on the side of a granite windrow, fell behind. He wound and climbed among masses between whose somberness the shadows and the cold lay heavy. Mists drifted in streamers under a sky that was wan and splashed with cirrus clouds. The colors of lichen, clumps of grass, patches of moss fairly shouted, so rare were they. Now and then somewhere a raven croaked. Mechanically Brandick recorded his location in his mind, but otherwise he wandered almost at random, scamping his search for signs of big game. If only Shalindra, he thought. If only Shalindra. She was no weakling. He had to concede her that much. Look how she struggled to maintain herself. And she was bright. She could learn what she needed to learn. Doubtless she would never be the best cook or den-keeper that a huntsman might have. But she could, for instance, turn her gift for things like calligraphy toward the making of decorated garments for which neighbors would trade what they themselves brought forth, including help with everyday tasks. Brandick's axe clove air. Forget her. Seeking to do that, he harked back to Aeth, his city that he would never see again. He called forth palaces, parks, porticos, kinfolk, friends, populace, and found, surprisingly, little homesickness in his heart. The city was a crumbling shell. Most of what few people remained grubbed the earth beyond its walls and had no hope. The few who kept a little wealth were as obsessed with the past as she was, if not more. It was his impatience with their sort as much as anything else which had driven him to make his expedition, and thus at last to Tyreen. Here the future lay. Here most were winning to a readiness to grapple with the world as it was, and he liked them for that. Why must she hold out? And why must he care? As sunbeams struck between clouds to dazzle him, suddenly he noticed that he had been scrambling for hours and was hungry. Yet that was not what halted him. It was something that, in the brightness, leapt forth at his attention. Huntsman's habit made him look around before he examined the sight more closely. He was halfway up a long slope on the lower flank of Ripsnarl. Grass and wild flowers grew in patches between scattered boulders. Well below him was a mossy hollow in among such rocks, intensely green against their gray. Ahead, the stone wilderness reared sharply toward a bank of talus beneath darkling palisades. Above those, wind-whirled crystals of dry snow wherein rainbow fragments danced, hid the spike of the mountain. He heard the air yowling up there. What stood immediately before him was a mass twice the size of any other in view, the bulk of a large house. The side that loomed over him as he confronted it was nearly flat. Had some natural force cloven the stone long ago? Or some magic? Certainly magic had been at work here, for a symbol had been chiseled into this face. Its boundary was a circle, a fathom across. Otherwise it was so eroded that he could only see it was of labyrinthine complexity. Did it, though, bear kinship to signs he had encountered on cliffs in the south? Brandick bent close in wonderment. His forefinger tried to trace faint lines and curves. A shiver went through him as he identified a Vi, that letter of the hieratic alphabet which was never used in writing. The memory of how potent it had been in gramarye was still too sharp. The raven flapped overhead. Somehow, abruptly, that winged blackness reminded Brandick of Alangru and the boy's claims about faring forth in animal guise. It didn't seem like childish fabulation. Alangru was too desperately serious about it. He didn't even act like a child trying to deny that his father was dead, trying in a way to be that father and wield forces which themselves were forever vanished. But if he wasn't daydreaming or play-acting, what then? Brandick's lips tightened. He had seen more than one person driven by despair to seek refuge in delusion, and those had been able-bodied adults. Alangru, frail and unripe soul in a body that from birth had been encumbered. Was Alangru simply insane? Poor Shalindra. Impulse outraced thought. Brandick retraced the sign while he spoke its name. Vi. which means, I guard. Earth rumbled and grated. Through his boot soles and into his bones he felt shock waves hit. The great stone shuddered. Lesser boulders toppled or rolled. In a tidal roar, the scree poured downward. Brandick spun on his heel and bounded ahead of the slide. If those shards caught him, they would cut him into flitches. It flashed across his mind. A wisp of power to hold mountains in place had remained in yonder emblem. He drained it off when he uttered the formula. Rip Snarl slumped further. A hammer blow cast him into night. As he returned today, he was not aware of pain. Instead, he was dazedly surprised by the silence. So vast was it, after the noise before, that he lay in it, as if in ocean depths, as if he had become a merman. The wind around the peak sounded fugitively faint. His heartbeat was no louder. He tried to raise himself. Then the agony smote. Darkness blew ragged across his vision. He heard his voice scream. After a while he grew capable of careful, small movements, and thus of learning what had happened to him. His right shin lay across a track plowed by the round rock which had overtaken him and come to rest several yards off. Though his mind was still clumsy and anguish dragged at every thought, he decided that it had knocked him down and passed over his leg. Soil had cushioned him somewhat. Little blood seemed to have been lost. But he saw the slight bend under his knee. That, as well as what he felt, told him the shin bone was broken. His right arm wouldn't obey him either. Every attempt at motion sent lightnings through him. The upper bone was likewise fractured. He guessed he had fallen with arms flung out and landed on that one in just the wrong way, the force of the boulder behind him. The rest of his body throbbed within his garments. He must have bruises from head to foot and be missing a good bit of skin. But there didn't seem to be anything worse the matter. Not that that would make much difference. He had barely escaped the talus. Pieces lay around him, and the main mass now began mere feet away. Higher aloft, half buried, the runic stone looked strangely forlorn. Brandick almost wished the slide had caught him. He'd be free of this torture. No. He began to curse. He cursed the mountain up the west side and down the east, roots and crown and the stupid god who erected it, for minutes, with the riches of oath and obscenity that a sailor commanded. It cleared his head and brought back a measure of strength. When he was done, he was ready to fight. To remain here was sure death. Kren and Destag would never find him in time. The odds were overwhelming that they never would at all, nor any search party they might fetch. But at least if he had water, he would live longer, and thus have a tiny chance. Moss in the hollow that he had noticed betokened moisture. A frightful distance to go in his present state, but the only way for him. He rolled to his left side, overbalanced, and fell prone on grit and flinders. Pain seethed. Icy sweat spurted forth, runneled inside his clothes and reeked in his nostrils. He mastered himself. The spears and pack of rations on his back had toppled him. With his usable hand and his teeth, he loosened their thongs. The axe he must leave behind, but he would not be without food and some means of doing battle. With one arm and one leg dragging his gear, he crawled. Often in the hours that followed, the pain wore him down. He must lie half-conscious, shivering, until at last he could hitch himself onward. The sun descended. The horizon flamed above far Tyrene. Stars blinked forth overhead. His breath smoked in deepening cold, and he saw frost form on the stones over which he crept. When he reached his goal, it was past midnight, and he knew he could travel no more. The moss was soft and dank under his belly. A rivulet trickled through it. He sucked up water for a very long time before his body stopped feeling withered and merely hurt. By now he was almost used to hurting. It should not keep him from the rest that was his next necessity. Of course, he thought in a distant part of his mind, water like this must draw animals. Maybe big flesh-eaters were among them. Somehow he got to the largest of the boulders which loomed murkily around, that he might have his back against it. He arranged his weapons ready to his left hand, and toppled into unawareness. That night, Olangru cried Brandek's name in his sleep, but when Shalindra went to comfort him, he turned toward the wall. He was silent and listless all the following day. By sunset he lay feverish, making small animal sounds. Shalindra poured him a decoction of willow bark. That potion, at least, still worked. But he gagged on the bitterness. Brandek, broken, freezing. Again and again the same words. Shalindra struggled with her pride, conquered it, and sent for Brandek, merely to learn that he'd gone hunting the day before yesterday, right after we quarreled. When he returned, let it be soon, she would ask him to see Olangru. He would come for the boy's sake, no matter how angry he was with her. He was gruff, but kind. His gifts had fed them through the winter, and he had never sought anything in return despite her being a woman and alone. Her cheeks burned. Why even think of that? Brandek could have any of a dozen girls, young, sturdy helpmates and childbearers. Doubtless he had made his choice and would soon wed. No matter for her concern. They could not talk together without flying at each other. After he came back, she would strive to be pleasant for Olangru's sake. Against a sudden dread. Of course he would come back. The sea itself had not slain him. He was a veteran hunter. That evening Destug brought word to his father, Kiernan the smith. He and Kren had drawn lots, and the latter stayed behind to search, though they held scant hope. They'd seen no smoke, and in yonder trackless country, full of half-mythic beasts. Shalindra was on her way home from the Lord Mayor's palace. She'd sought wine for Olangru, and had been told that Tyrene's precious and dwindling store was not to be wasted on a useless witling. Beyond the door of the Green Merman, she heard voices mutter, and Brandek's name was mentioned. She entered and saw Destug. Were they back from the hunt already? "Get a large party to search for him," Destug was saying. "Surprising he'd come to grief, but, well, I had the notion his mind was mostly elsewhere."
"What will we do?"
That was Kiernan's basso. He spread work-roughened hands. Shalindra had to know. She drew her cloak about her and stepped full into the ill-lit room. Soapstone lamps, newly made, guttered on shelves and the table. Brandek's design. Their smoke, combined with man-sweat and stale beer, stung her eyes. The men hushed their talk. Many more than usual were present. They must have gathered to discuss appalling news. Benches scraped as some of the older ones rose. The youngsters eyed her with indifference. "I overheard," she said into the abrupt silence. "Someone is missing?" "Brandek?"
"Aye, lady,"
Gilm slurred. He was far gone in drink.
"Destug here brought word. Away in the chaos country they were, and him beyond finding in that jumble, I'm thinking."
Shalindra turned pale. Her knees buckled, and she slid to the floor. Gilm lurched forward, slopping his beer.
"Catch her quick! There, what ails you, lady?"
He rose and shook his head.
"She's fainted. We'd best get her home. Funny thing, her taking on like that. She and Brandek was never friends."
Again it was night, and the stars mercilessly brilliant. Among them the silver torrent glimmered along a frozen course, and sometimes a meteor darted. Though the moon had not yet risen, light was enough to show hoarfrost pale on rocks and moss, and the rivulet agleam. Its tiny tinkle was the only sound Brandick could hear save for the breath that rattled through his lungs. By dawn the water would be ice. He drew his good knee under his chin and hugged his good arm around it, holding to a trifle of warmth. If he just had a sleeping bag he could crawl into that. But it was back in camp. Cold had soon wakened him last night. During the day he had gotten some rest. Now came the long watch until morning. It might be as well this way. Lions, wolves, and their ilk did most of their work after sunset. But it deepened the weariness in him, hour by hour. He had no means of kindling fire, and the fire in his body smoldered low. Pain was lessened a little. Partly that was because he had splinted the broken leg, lashing it to a spear shaft grounded in his boot, and kept the broken arm inside his coat with the hand under his belt. However, he recognized that whatever slight relief he felt was also due to the numbness of fatigue. How long had he to live? Water was here in plenty and food sufficient. He didn't leave rations unguarded for animals to find, but packed them along. He had scant appetite, must indeed force himself to fuel his flesh against chill. Yes, he thought, starvation would not move in on him as fast as exposure and exhaustion. He downright wished that a beast of prey would arrive first. He meant to go out fighting, no matter how feebly, and to thrust a spear down the gullet of a bear was better than to sit trying to defy these nights, like Shalindra defying the future. Better? Easier. She had never borne a weapon, but she had overcome more than he could imagine by enduring it. How far away, how dreamlike she seemed. He started out of a drowse. What? The sound repeated. An owl. His bad side protested as he turned his head in search. The owl had landed on a tall rock not far off. It was one of the great white ones that were moving south ahead of the glaciers. Starlight filled its eyes and made it doubly spectral. It said again, in a dull fashion. He wondered why. The tone was softer than he had ever heard before from its kind, almost caressing. Bitterness surged in him. "Oh, yes," he said aloud. "You're welcome to pick my bones, but not till I'm done with them." He fumbled about, closed fingers on a stone, and threw it left-handed. He missed, of course, yet it should have frightened the owl off. It didn't. The bird simply cocked its head and continued to stare at the man. A shudder, which was not from cold, passed through him. He had found to his woe that a ghost of magic lingered in this desolation. It was gone. But was there more? The owl spread wings. For a moment it held quiet thus, like a talisman of snow. Then it lifted. In 3 silent circles, it swung over Brandick's head before departing westward. Gilm and Kiernan bore Shalindra to the library and sent Risaya, Hente's daughter, to care for her and her ailing son. The tall young woman sat by the fire and stitched skins, her movements deft. Garments for Brandick? Shalindra wondered, and began shaking anew despite her warm wrap. Finally, she spoke. How is Alangru?" "Much the same," Risaya said. "He was sleeping when— Oh! Here he comes." Wraith-like, the boy padded into the main room. His nightshire hung loose, and his face seemed all huge blue eyes with the strange gray ring around the iris. He held out his palms to the hearth. "Brandick has no fire," he said. "He shivers at night." Risaya dropped her sewing. "What did you say, boy? How can you know anything about Brandick?" Her tone was shrill. She gulped and gathered back her work. "Surely you dreamed it," Shalindra said. "You've been feverish." But Olandru had fallen ill before word of Brandick came. He had not left the library. How could he know? Olandru shook his head. "You always say I dream things, Mother, or scold me for making them up. But I was there. I just got back. I know." "We've all heard your wild stories," Rasiah jeered. "No one believes them. You should be ashamed. What would Brandick say?" "Brandick never laughs at me. I saw, and I know." With an attempt at dignity, the boy stumbled from the room. He scurried down dark streets to the Green Merman. Inside, men still huddled and talked. "We've got to go out tomorrow and search," Destug argued. "We can't quit until we're sure." "Ah, he's dead already," Hente mumbled. "As will we all be soon. Probably lose half our party in the jumbled lands. It's not worth it just to bring home a corpse." Olandru shivered. Most of these persons thought him half-witted, and their children taunted him. But he had a duty. He stepped forward into the lamplight. The greasy beer-soaked table reached to his breast. Laughter greeted him.
"A bit young for taverns, aren't you, boy?"
Turbot japed. And from Gilm,
"Is your mother all right? Does she and Rasiah know you're out?"
Olandru took a deep breath. Now, more than ever, he must not stammer. It's Brandick. He's alive. I know where he is." Mirth barked around the table. I do so. I saw him," he gulped. "He's on the west face of Ripsnarl, near the bottom. There was an avalanche. You couldn't find him amongst all those rocks, but I found him from above, and on my way back I noticed how to get there on foot. I can guide you." Laughter tried to start afresh, but spluttered into silence. They stared. A couple of them drew signs in the air. After many heartbeats, Destug rose from his bench and whispered, "How did you do that?" "I went. I flew." Olandru struggled against tears. "He's hurt, Brandick is. His leg and his arm both. He's freezing. And I saw lions not far off hunting, only there wasn't any game nearby, so they'll be hungry and look farther tomorrow." The tears burst forth, but on a tide of rage. Olandru clenched his fist and stamped. "And you sit here!" he screamed. "He taught you how to hunt and make weapons and keep food and everything. And the first time he needs help, you just sit here." Kiernan the smith chewed his lip and stared at the table. Hente muttered, "The boy's crazy." And Larry whispered, "Magic is gone." Then Fearlay said most quietly,
"It has seemed thus. But now I wonder if a little remains after all."
Olandru swayed back and forth. "Aya, aya," he chanted. "It's cold and dark. The man lies by the water, hurt. He cannot run, and the lions prowl. I found him. He did not know me, and threw a stone at me. But I came back to take you to him. Ah, ooh, ooh, ooh." His fingers crooked like talons. In the flickery gloom, his eyes seemed to glow golden. Destug took a step forward and reached out a hand. The boy shrank back. "No!" he coughed in a voice not altogether human. Most of the company sat stiff or leaned away as far as they could without rising and perhaps drawing that eerie gaze. Fearley kept moveless, save for the lips within his white beard that said,
"Here is either madness indeed, or something new and powerful. If it is simply madness, what do you risk by heeding?"
A flame leapt in Destug. "Yes," the youth shouted. "Langru, the men of Tyrene will follow us." Kiernan rose, massive to his feet, and said,
"Count me among them when we're ready, son. That won't be till dawn, I suppose, and most won't be in shape to travel as fast as you. But we ought to reach Brandeck by tomorrow's eventide if this—" His tone stumbled. "This child really is a seer."
He forced a smile.
"Meantime, suppose I try persuading his mother to let him go along."
The sun went down once more. A single crimson streak marked the place beneath the purity of a westering planet. In that direction the sky was green. Eastward it darkened to violet, and the earliest stars trod forth. There Ripsnarl Peak stood windless under its snows. This would be another clear upland night. Cold. Cold. Brandeck woke when the lion roared nearby. He was barely half aware of that noise or what it meant. His skull seemed hollowed out. He could no longer sense a heartbeat, and pain was like the rocks everywhere around, eternal but apart from him. Yet when the beast surmounted a ridge of debris and poised on top, he felt a certain comfort. Here came his last battle, and then peace. She was a lioness, her tawny flanks vague in the dusk, but eyes luminous in the forward-thrusting head. He did see her tail switch, and heard the rumble from her throat. Brandeck reached for a spear. Sitting, he braced its butt against the boulder on which he leaned. If he was lucky, he might catch her charge on the sharp-flaked point. Doubtless that would not kill her, but she'd know she'd been in a fight. A second and a third lioness appeared on either side of the first. A new roar echoed among the stones. Their male waited behind them. Brandeck sighed.
"Very well," he said. "This'll be quick, anyhow."
Something stirred at the edge of vision. He glanced aloft and saw an Arctic owl. Was it the same as last night's? It acted as strangely, wheeling about and winging off at an unnatural speed. The first lioness finished studying him and flowed down the rubble heap. Her comrades followed. When they reached the moss, they moved to right and left. Brandeck grinned.
"Don't worry," he croaked. "I'm not about to make a break for it."
The lead lioness gathered herself for the final dash. "Yah!" cried from above. Brandeck saw a hand-axe, his own design, fly through the air end over end. It struck her in the ribs. That was a heavy piece of flint with keen edges. He heard the thunk. Blood ran forth, black in this dimness. She growled and crouched back. Her companions went stiff. Brandeck twisted his head around and saw men spring from between the boulders into the hollow. They brandished spears, axes, knives, torches. They threw stones. They formed a wall in front of him. More by voice than sight, he recognized Kren, Destug, Kiernan, Wisnar. He fell into an abyss. When he came to himself, he was lying among them. They squatted, stood, danced, babbled their joy, or bellowed their triumph. Few more stars were in sight. He had not been unconscious for long. The lions must be gone. Of course they would be, he thought. Animals are too sensible for bravado. They're off after easier game to nourish themselves and their young. Brandeck's head was on Destug's lap. The youth stroked his hair with anxious gentleness.
"Are you well, sir?" he breathed.
If Brandeck had had the strength, his laughter would have made the mountain ring. He did achieve a chuckle.
"I haven't caught the sniffles."
he replied in a whisper. Wonder smote.
"How did you find me, and this many of you?"
Awe possessed the dimly seen face above him.
"Landgru."
As if that had been a signal, the boy came into sight. Men stepped aside to make a way for him.
He guided us.
Kiernan's words were an undergroundish mumble.
We took turns carrying him on our shoulders till, near the end, suddenly he swooned. When he woke after a while, he said we must hurry because you were in great danger, so we did.
The son of Shalindra knelt down at Brandik's side, smiled shyly into his eyes, and murmured, "I'm glad. You are always good to us." Rain turned the world dull silver. It brawled over the roofs of Tyrene and gurgled between walls. The Madwoman River ran swollen, and from afar one heard the sea shout. The air was raw. Yet as she passed a hillock which had been a house, Shalindra saw that a tree which grew from it had broken into full blossom. The door of Brandik's dwelling was never barred, for he had nothing to fear from his tribe. Besides, she came in daily to care for his needs. Nobody disputed the right of Elangru's mother to do that. Entering, discarding her leather cloak, she must grope through weak lamplight till her pupils widened and she saw him, wrapped in furs, sitting up in bed. Restless, awkward, his left hand used a piece of charcoal to sketch plans for a weir upon a scrap of hide. "How are you?" she asked.
"Pretty well," he said. "I hobbled around some more on a pair of sticks this morning, and it didn't hurt. I can do a few things with my arms also. Let me show you."
He raised it in its splints.
"Oh, yes, I'll soon be as good as new and more annoying."
His gaze sought hers.
"Thanks to you,"
he added, not for the first time. She winced at the memory. When he, brought back home, refused the attentions of Jaeth, the chirurgeon, she had gone to her books. There she found anatomical drawings. Holding those before her, she directed the sinewy hands of Kiernan as the smith properly set the broken bones. Brandik had declined wine, saying it ought to be saved for worse cases. He had not screamed, he had not even fainted, but he had lain mute and white throughout the following day. Afterward, though, she busied herself setting forth wooden bowls and filling them with the fish she had cooked in leaves and clay and brought here in a skin. It was lucky, she thought, that in the murk he could not see how she flushed. "Everybody will rejoice to hear that," she said. "They need you." Brandik stirred uneasily.
"I hope they don't think they can't get along without me. Someday, tomorrow or 50 years hence, no matter which, they must. They've got to learn the tricks of staying alive in the world as it's become."
He plucked at the wizened robe across his lap.
"So much to do," he grumbled, "and I must lie in this stinking hovel. Caves or shelters under overhanging cliffs or tents or nearly anything would be more comfortable, and we get fewer people falling sick. Yes, I think Elangru would fare better too, but first we have to find our way to the how of such things. This very year I begin, after I'm truly on my feet again."
He sat back against a rolled-up bearskin. His left hand reached toward her. His voice dropped.
"Of course,"
he said low.
"That means the end of your books and other treasures. We can't save them if we move out. We can only take along in our heads what knowledge they give us that we can use, like how to treat fractures. I'm sorry, Shalindra."
He seldom spoke at such length, or so mildly. She gave him his food and sat down on a bedside stool, a bowl on her knees. "It can't be helped," she sighed. "I've come to see that. As you have come to regret it, my dear, her mind added, which is worth many books to me. She took a chunk of fish. Utensils of metal and porcelain would presently belong to the past, like tableware. Maybe a craftsman could produce substitutes of wood, bone, or horn, but probably none would have the time. They would be too busy inventing tools more urgently needed by hunters on the fringe of the glacier. She might as well practice how to eat in mannerly wise with her fingers.
"It's the future, you know," he said. "Like it or not, it is. And you're not just born along helpless, Shalindra. You can have a great deal to say about how it goes in your own right and through Alangru." He paused. "After all, in spite of his power, he's still a boy. He still has much to learn from you and any stepfather he might get." Her pulse, her blood, cried out. She barely kept from spilling her dish. Brandick stared at the shadows beyond his bed. "Where is he today?" he asked. "He usually comes here with you."
"He may arrive later," she replied in chosen words. "He told me he meant to— Well, do you remember Mintu, that brat who took the lead in persecuting him because he was odd? Mintu has become his most abject follower after what happened. Alangru told me he thinks he will need helpers, and he had ideas about what Mintu can do. They were going to experiment with a drum and I don't know what."
"You know more than I do," Brandick said. "I'm so ignorant about magic that I nearly got myself killed under the He-Whirlas. I'm sure of nothing except that it's not altogether gone from the world, and some of it remains in him. Your studies." He turned his head to her. "Can you tell me more?" She had expected this, once he regained strength and with it his liveliness of mind. Again he reached out, and this time she gave him her hand. His closed around it, hard, warm, comforting. "I've ransacked the library and my own thoughts, of course," she said while she brought her face near his because she was talking softly. "I've discovered little. This is such a new phenomenon. However, the principle is basic, that anything different, peculiar, has a certain amount of mana by virtue of that same differentness. And Alangru was always a strange one, wasn't he?" Of a sudden she heard herself add, "I don't imagine any other children I bear will be like him," and stopped in total confusion, and saw Brandick's mouth curve happily upward. The smile died. His glance went past her. She twisted about and saw Alangru. Today the slight form moved with cat-like grace. She wondered, in what shape would his soul next travel forth? And shivered. How dank the house was. Yes, open-air life would be hard, but would in truth be healthier. Alangru had not shed his rain-wet cape. From the cave of its hood, his gaze sought Brandick. Those eyes gleamed like a lynx's. He raised a hand in salute and declared with a gravity beyond his years, "Chieftain, Mintu's drumming sent me out of my body, and I met the reindeer spirit. He told me a big herd of them is moving this way, and we can have plenty of meat. But he also told me this will not be. They will go elsewhere, unless we give him and them their due respect." Breath hissed between Shalindra's teeth. Her grip on Brandick tightened. He took the news calmly, almost matter-of-factly. "Aye," he said, nodding. "I thought it had come to something like this." "What do you mean?" Shalindra gasped. Alangru sat down on the floor at her feet, cross-legged, facing the brightest of the lamps. "Why, we're no longer masters of the world," Brandick told her. "We're back in the world, as much as animals or trees or stones or anything. What was killing our souls was that we didn't realize this.
We had no idea of where we belonged, or what we should believe, or how we should behave. I found, myself, skills not enough. Understanding rushed through Shalindra. "No," she whispered, "it isn't. But we'll always have a few among us who are wise about the hidden things." She bent her mind toward her son, though her hand stayed with Brandek's. "What should we do, then, to please the reindeer?" she asked. "I do not yet know," Olangru answered, "but I will find out." The first of the shamans fixed his eyes upon the lamp flame.